ask maybe Whitney. Sophie, can you tell us again which button it's the second?
Second from the bottom.
Second, it's the bottom. The second one from the far right, and then you just press a button.
Get it a little less light.
You're trying to shut off the spotlight in my eyes. Yeah. Okay. I think that's doing it.
Better?
It's going down. Yes. Perfect. Thank you. Key readings. Janet Abulagat, I mentioned the contrast among the three biggest cities, feeding in then to Daniel Elazar, main reading in this area. He wrote 50 books. I'm giving you a couple of very simple ideas. The main ideas that are in the reading are for the U.S. The international global context is where and why does political emerge and change. And he has 2 or 3 bigger concepts like the frontier, covenants, claiming a new territory through a frontier, democratic participation, and his 2 main classic examples were the ancient Jews and the ancient Israelites. They had in common elements, overlapping elements, and then some distinctive elements leading into Western civilization, which is now spreading around the world today. It's not just called Western, it's more global. But these things are being fought over in places like the Middle East, or dealt with in terms of cultural policy in China in ways that say we don't want just the same kind of global culture, we want to reshape aspects of it or fight aspects of it. They also generated the monotheism, one God rather than 12 gods. Many religions would see the history of the world as a cyclical process. And there are multiple gods that may be part of this. A god of rain, a god of the family, and the like. And people could pray and make tangible material offerings to different gods to try to appeal to them and to have a good harvest for the corn and the like. Monotheism said no. You're cutting a deal and you're trying to bribe the gods. In monotheism, God knows everything. And you can't lie to him. You can't buy him off. It implies a concept of progress as well, potentially, that you, instead of saying engage in a cyclical series of no change, that his history is not just cyclical. The narrow version is its progress. You see this in Marx, for instance, in the stages of history in a quite literal manner. You see it in salvation, of trying to move in that away from the polytheistic civilizations that worship many gods in their natural habitats. The Greeks and the Jews also codified their philosophy and theology in the Bible. Philo, a Jew in the Hellenic city of Alexandria, codified both into a single system that was adopted by Christianity and became the core ideas of Western civilization for about 1,600 years until Spinoza challenged it. Meanwhile, much of the Middle East and much of the large empires were continually changing with war. That is, these 2 little countries only were important, innovative for about 50 years, 100 years, very short time periods. Their impact was not primarily through the people. It was through the ideas, through the Bible, through writings which spread from them, through the Greek classics, which thus got dug up a little bit, which carried on a little bit directly, and then much more indirectly with the Italians beginning new trade, and then in the Renaissance, and I mentioned Francis I as a spread in and helped to transform the Middle Ages of the Europeans into more contemporary civilization. But most of the world surrounding these few countries were much more hierarchical empires. Egypt, Asia Minor, the Babylonians, the Persians, India, China. Although their religions and the caste system persisted in most regions, which speaks to the durability of religion as a core element of civilization. Even Daniel Bell stresses this same point in The Rise of Post-Industrial Society, which is mainly focused on technology. Okay, I'm going fast because in other courses, global local politics, political sociology, we explore this a little more, and his books are there for those who want them. The next big phase was Protestantism, with Martin Luther, who comprised, who developed an offshoot of the Roman Catholic Church with its hierarchical organization and said, we will let each individual read the Bible separately, and we will have congregations in different cities and countries, and they may do things differently. However, he also worked with the princes, the kings of countries, and said, let me be your official church here in Sweden or in this part of Germany, and you can choose who the ministers will be in the church, so we won't have political conflict. And in that way, many of northern German areas, much of Scandinavia, became Lutheran, officially Lutheran. Although you have Lutherans in the U.S., you have Lutherans in Japan, they're spread around the world, and it was the initial major Protestant religion. Second was Calvin. And so Calvin was more radical. He said Luther is a sellout to the political leadership. We, the Calvinists, say the church, each church must be chosen in terms of its reading of the scriptures. Our relationship directly to God is what gives us our legitimacy, not through a prince or a king. And so so he left Paris, where this was impossible to say, was in Switzerland, where it was acceptable, and in the Netherlands. Then they had followers in Scotland. A few trickled into England, but England was always that I won't say always. England went up and down in its degree of tolerance for this what were called these non-conformist Protestant sects. They had the Church of England, which was nominally Catholic, but the style was more hierarchically close to the Catholics. Calvinism was thus persecuted by the English from time to time, so that if you were a Methodist, if you were a certain Baptist, members of certain sects, you could not practice law, you could not be a civil servant, you could not teach at the universities. And in those time periods, you had big migrations to places like New England, Salem, Massachusetts, Boston, Newburyport, and so forth. This then led to the spreading, or that is the identification, the formation, and the carrying. So one of Elazar's big theoretical points is, simple theoretical point is, culture spreads on the backs of people. And if you take a ship from London to Boston, you bring your culture with you. That's the simple model of how culture spreads. And in this way, he distinguishes within the U.S. three main cultures. And I'll stay over here because we've got more closer to camera. We have the New England moralistic political culture, which came from Calvinism in the history that I've sketched. We had a Middle Atlantic political culture centered around New York, which was initially New Amsterdam, Dutch, but it had a more market-oriented focus in this political culture, illustrated by Donald Trump's discussion of contracts. Contracts are an old concept. Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau talked about the contract as what holds us together. This is different from the covenant, which was a contract including God, in the manner that the New Englanders included a moralistic, godly linked confirmation of the creation of the state of Massachusetts, the state of Rhode Island, in ways that you do not find in New York or Virginia. And so Elazar looked at all these constitutions and made that as one point. The second point, the Middle Atlantic, I'll just list here some of the characteristics in a minute, but in terms of the big pattern of migration, defining the Southern hierarchical traditional political culture, three overlapping names: Southern, hierarchical, or traditional, traditionalistic. These are the three political cultures which he distinguishes, and then, importantly, they continue on across the U.S. roughly with covered wagons and horseback and so forth. So that even today, the suggestion is these make Portland, Oregon a very different place than Waco, Texas, and so forth. Similarly, he has mapped elsewhere, or mapped or discussed how many countries of the world have elements of this covenant culture, or others that are fighting against it, and thus different countries in Latin America vary in these patterns, for instance, and the coastal region of China from the inland of China, etc. The bigger point is, with the end of the Cold War, 1989, the New England political culture is gaining more and more support, sometimes combined with this individualism, around the world, through the internet, through NGOs, through religious efforts to convert people religiously, the Mormons, volunteers in hospitals. The Koreans are the largest society contributing efforts to send proselytizing religious activists to Africa, to Latin America, so that today, even in Brazil and Argentina, which are nominally Catholic, Roman Catholic countries settled by the Spanish, there are more people in the Protestant churches on Sunday than there are in the Catholic churches. So Protestantism has spread in recent years very fast. And so the Pope is worried and things are changing. Okay. But politically, in terms of this course, the key point is the values which Elazar then traces back to the ancient Greeks are now changing what the Chinese say in their negotiations in the United Nations. They talk more about human rights, individualism, and so forth. The internet, who should be able to have access to the internet. That is, the discussion globally is informed increasingly by elements or put differently, simply. The number one issue in much of the world today is very different from 20, 30 years ago, especially locally. It is what? Corruption. National, and especially national governments like the Chinese are explicitly talking about corruption is destroying the economy. We have to make the government, make the whole system more efficient. The economy will work better. Simply bribing people is not acceptable. And I mentioned China, Russia, much of the world, including, we've studied it here in detail in Chicago, for instance, had not only been governed by a clientelist system, but it's under attack and it's now changing. So where and how these alternatives come in, and how you move away from what is sometimes called corruption to different practices without just killing people, without just hanging them, but trying to convert people to do things in ways that they find appropriate, is now a key element of what in the U.S. historically, in let's say the 20th century, has been called reform politics. So one battle is between the so-called reformers and the machine, and how those work. And we'll talk. And so this is a way that these have been described as distinctive political cultures. The machine has more support from this Middle Atlantic tradition. Um, Daily One was asked by the press, why'd you give those contracts to your son's insurance firm? A clientelist leading question, and his answer was, who knows the famous answer? You all should know this for future. It's a father's duty to help his sons. Okay, that is, he was saying, clientelism is what we should do. It's moralistically appropriate. Okay, the son, Daily 2, if he were asked the same question, what might he have said? We went through competitive bidding and my sons came out first. That is, he would not defend clientelism. Chicago has become reformed publicly in ways that political leaders do not endorse it the way they did with Daily One. Okay. These are fighting issues in much of the world today with different levels of government and so forth. The Chinese national government is more reformed. The local governments are more clientelist, etc. Just maybe list a bit more of the components. 3 cultures. Individualistic. Politics is a business activity focused on commerce. Depending on what's acceptable, politicians can help everyone or just their supporters. Parties provide organization. Government is expanded only if there's citizen demand for it. Bureaucracy is necessary, not a strict meritocracy. Second, the moralistic New England. Politics is a public activity focused on the common good. Politicians use power to benefit the community as a whole. Issues provide organization, not parties. Politicians expand government to solve problems. Bureaucracy is necessary, and there is a strict meritocracy. There was a later book by Gorski on Prussia, and how Prussia moved in this moralistic Calvinist direction. And he followed what I cited the Chinese inspector is doing. When Frederick the Great became king, became emperor of Prussia, he said, henceforth all civil servants will follow my religion and you must convert to Calvinism. 1. 2, if you are caught taking a bribe, you will be hung. Okay. And Prussia then became the world's leading bureaucracy in ways that Max Weber would talk about. It became the core then of after unification, the national German state. And it's an archetypical, strong organization. But the question which is being asked in places like China, Russia, Africa, how can you prevent or curtail corruption? Part of the answer comes from the values of the leaders, the participants in the bureaucracy, and the people, that all 3 are important. The context defining the operation of a political institution like a bureaucracy is critical, as we will continually discuss. In the traditional 3rd political culture, politics is an activity for the elite, focused on protecting the status quo. Politicians use their power to maintain the hierarchy of society. Social and family ties provide organization. Political parties promote too much openness. So families and smaller sets of connections are the drivers. Government is not expanded to solve problems. Bureaucracy interferes with informal interpersonal relationships and is used minimally for administration. Okay, so the point is, these are seen as the correct, normal rules of the game. And if you live in one of these archetypical cultures, you tend to carry it with you, and you tend to follow it, and in ways that you don't just see as optional. It's life. Daly didn't say in Chicago under clientelism it's a father's duty to help his sons. He said it's a father's duty to help his sons. All fathers should do that. Okay. Clearly, each of these is an ideal type. We have mixtures within the head of one person. Daly, too, for instance, followed his father sometimes under the table and still had a clientelist set of relations to some degree. But publicly, and giving his speeches and defending his policies, he was reformer, anti-clientelist. In that sense, he was the son, as I've sometimes said controversially, he was the son of Harold Washington more than of his own father in terms of that part of his policies. The moralism, the public good, the reform. Each city, each person is unique. We have mixtures of these. People move from Texas to Minnesota, from Minnesota to Southern California. They can carry parts of those, so we can have combinations. So one can say, at what age did you move, and look at these to try to look at individual cases and personalities. We have more survey, broader scale efforts to capture these and to map how the differences still persist. And we're in we'll see parts of the research involving some of this as we proceed. But there's a lot going on, informed by these kinds of ideas. Let me say a word or two linking Elazar to the new political culture analysis, in part because Elazar and I worked together for 10 plus years. He came to Chicago and we were actively worked every day together for several months, and then he died, unfortunately, melanoma. We did not finish the book which we started called Political Cultures of the World. And we had 5 civilizational bases, foundations, from Northern European Protestantism, Southern European Catholicism with Latin America, the Muslim Middle East, and the Hindu and Confucian civilizations, defining a civilizational pattern in the Asian countries. We used the World Values Survey. We developed some propositions, and we see elements of this that you'll see in other things which we're continuing with. But one big idea which you have in much of this is hierarchy. That is, Calvin and Luther, or Luther to some degree, Calvin more, moved away from the Roman Catholic Church with its administrative hierarchy. The Calvinist churches of the Netherlands, and today in much of the world, select their leaders, their aldermen as they are called, by the congregation. The citizens choose the leaders of the church. The aldermen are the main governors. There may be a minister. The minister is chosen by those aldermen. That is, it is not the Roman Catholic Church or the Lutheran Church or the Communist Party, which is top down. It is bottom up in a very simple organizational structure, which makes it challenge and conflict with conceptions of hierarchy. So if you have a church working that way and you have a state that is top down, there's a implicit criticism. And so, especially for instance, one example, in the colonies, African, Asian colonies of the English, the French, the Germans, the Belgians, the colonial administrations were very hierarchical from especially the Catholic countries. Not so for England. The English permitted, that is, dissenting groups would be hung, arrested, whatever, in places like the Belgian Congo, been fought about for much of the 20th century. The English, by contrast, permitted, the administrators did not do this themselves, but they permitted Methodists, Baptists, and others to build churches in Nigeria, in South Africa, and other places, where they would translate the Bible into Swahili or other languages, and they would teach people how to read. They were illiterate. They taught them to read using the Bible. And these nonconformist churches educated because they believed that power literacy, leadership, the good things come from the people in an egalitarian manner. So this bottom-up pattern was tolerated by the British administrators and has made the British colonies distinctive from the Belgian and others in terms of the relative degree of political democracy and participation in surveys which have been done of this around the world. But if the issue is not what's the name of the country, the issue is why. And one of the key variables here is simply hierarchy. The more the hierarchy, the simpler one proposition. So this in turn informs. I'm mentioning Elazar and I work together because we tried to put together some of our ideas, and one of the core ideas was hierarchy. Hierarchy made the ancient Greeks and Israelites distinctive from the Egyptians, from the others, which had large hierarchical organizations for their political leadership, as you have later on, say, in the American South, under slavery, you still had nonconformist churches, say after 1865, where African Americans could go to church. They may have been racially excluded or discriminated against. They could not join country clubs or go to certain restaurants or whatever, but they could go to an African American church. And in the churches, in the South especially, they developed political organization, social networks of helping one another, social work, care, help for the elderly, lending money potentially. That is, the churches became more holistic organizations, so that today, if you go to the south side of Chicago or you go into to Detroit and listen to African American ministers, they say, don't vote for that guy Trump. That is, politics is explicitly discussed in church in ways that it is not done in the Roman Catholic Church or most of the more so-called establishment Protestant churches, which are predominantly white nationally. So we have differences in the ways that these impact the political process in city, neighborhood, urban dynamics because of the politicization of some of these church activities. Similarly, in a more loose secular manner, the classic examples of where and how has the hierarchy that dominated so much of the world changed. I'm mentioning the church from 1865 onward in the South, even if African Americans did not have any impact on many villages or smaller towns or whatever, and where they may have been a minority. More generally, that model what made that model then become major nationally and then globally? Martin Luther King. He combined his African American Protestant background with Gandhi's non-violence. He went and studied in India. He learned from the moralists, the gurus of the Indian jungle that Max Weber wrote about, that you are more powerful if you do not use or invoke violence. If you use and create and construct and build your moral authority, you will have more impact. And he did so with huge success. So rather than, so in the 1930s, union management battles in the late 19th century, they fought each other, they beat each other up, they shot each other. That is, violence was common. It was seen as a normal resource and still is in much of the world. This changed with Gandhi, it changed with Martin Luther King. And as whereas the media, especially in the 21st century, as the media have become more important, and as moralism has spread, the idea of simply using violence to advance your program still is happening. Clearly it happens in the last week. Las Vegas, we don't know if there's a political program, but the political terrorism is a major issue globally. But the general point is most people, most of the time, don't use guns. They talk, you have social media, and this is a residue which is come in part from the civil rights movement, feeding into new social movements, the environment, women's organizations, a series, sustainability, human rights. These new organizations have been highly successful, even if they were resisted by the lead political parties, because they didn't fit in with them so well initially. Even the parties of the left in Europe refused to include environmentalists. So in Germany, they started a Green Party. And the Green Party, as a separate party or as branches of other political parties, has had huge impact as citizens have grown more concerned about it. So, the New Political Culture book, there's 7 books, and the one with that title on the reading list, I just want to articulate 1 or 2 quick points. The NPC, New Political Culture, contrasts with 2 earlier traditions of political leadership. The first we've discussed is clientelism, sometimes linked with agriculture and the relationship of a landowner to workers of the land, and the landowner would help the workers over generations in material manner such that clientelist pattern persisted and still does. The second is class politics. You know most from Marx. The proletariat versus the bourgeoisie, and the high and the low, the haves and the have-nots, are the basis of political organization. Okay, strong model. Many people will see this as everything, and that clientelism is just corruption, and we need good class politics. All right, class politics has been going down in much of the world in conjunction with many complicated things, but we have a challenge in the form of this new political culture. And this is a third pattern, and so it could be defined as the emergence of social issues, such as I've been discussing: racial discrimination, human rights, the environment, peace, or let's say disarmament, world peace. These initially emerged as specific issues that were not pursued by the major political parties, the left or the right. And because they were new, people tended to sometimes follow these new issues, and this is then has been called issue politics, and contrasted with classic party politics. So the NPC is classically issue politics, and often involves these new issues. And I'll illustrate with 1 or 2 examples. Why are these important for cities? Outside the U.S., cities are even more distinct than the countryside. Rural Japan, China are drastically different from the urban areas. In Japan, the LDP, the Liberal Democratic Party, controls the diet via basically classic clientelism. However, in Tokyo, Osaka, Kyoto, the LDP has lost, 10 plus years ago, their political leadership to governors, mayors. One of the first was a guy who campaigned on a bicycle. Another was a TV comedian. They each spent about $10,000. Nothing. And they won. Even though the LDP, this massive party, spent millions and millions of dollars. They had workers, they had campaign workers, they gave bribes, and they've done it successfully, and they still do it successfully in the rural areas. But in the big cities, as citizens, some citizens grew more highly educated. They wanted aspects of reform. They didn't want the traditional clientelist corruption. They wanted to be more individualistic. So you have in these mayors in Japan, an illustration. Bogota, Colombia, Mayor Mocas won and was reelected in ways that was a revolution, even in the drug capital of Colombia. In New York and Los Angeles, Republican mayors Giuliani and Bloomberg were socially liberal centrists, who were, in this sense, very different from Ronald Reagan, who was a classic Republican. He grew up in a small town, and his social program was something that the party tried to play down. That is the one way we can distinguish these is to, we have social liberalism and fiscal liberalism. Plus and minus, plus and, sorry, I'll go here. Fiscal liberalism over here, plus and minus. So social liberalism plus, if you're socially liberal and fiscally liberal, this is the classic left, the Democratic Party in the U.S. This is the classic right, Ronald Reagan. The socially conservative, fiscally liberal is sometimes called ethnic politics, in the sense that ethnicity is not part of normal social liberalism. Here's the NPC over here. That is, they're fiscally, they're fiscally conservative relative and closer to the Republicans, but they're liberal on the social issues. Participation, citizen participation, issue politics, meritocracy, and specifically productivity. That is, how can you combine less taxes and more social programs? The normal reaction from the left and the right is you cannot. It's hypocrisy. The people here say we can at least try, and we're driven to do so by our party program, which is to say equal access, helping everyone, but doing it with more efficient government. Not necessarily cutting government, but holding down growth. And that effort to move in this direction, that is the ideological combination of these two major dimensions, drives them toward productivity, of trying to get government to work more efficiently. And in places like China or Chicago, massive improvements in productivity have been made because there was lots of room for it. So these have been often cited as successes. The famous examples: Bill Clinton, Tony Blair, Francois Mitterrand, who was before Blair and Mitterrand. And within the French Socialist Party, this has gone up, the NPC has gone up and down, and sometimes it's moved more in a traditional left direction. So within each political party, you can have changes. So the national parties are important pieces of this. They're important independent variables in a sense, that they're not simply following direct. That is, if we come back, you rightly asked a good question last time. How do we use this sort of general framework of policy outputs, leadership in here, with things in general, including parties, or you can have issue leadership, issue-specific policy leadership, such as through referenda, through petitions, and so forth. And if we have here sort of citizen and community characteristics, economic base, education, income, and so forth, that is, where and why do we have things going through the leadership or not? The NPC book builds about 25 propositions that take each of those sets of boxes and says where and why do we have change? Why do we move away from clientelism, away from class politics, and toward this NPC? And it's a multi-causal set of propositions which then have been tested in 7 books. one on citizen surveys, one on mayors, one which is a case study Chicago, one which is a book on the breakdown of class politics, on voters and voting with Marty Lipset, and another book on citizens with more of European focus. Then this continues with the work on the Scenes Project. But the core definitions is on pages, in the NPC book, on pages 11 to 13. The definitions of the NPC, I've given you an overview. The key graphics, that is, the 7 books. I don't have a slide. I don't want to waste the time to get PowerPoint running, but that is, there's a three. Look at the 3 graphics on pages 34, 35, and 37 on the definitions and causes, and then I've written down 22 propositions. Okay, the causes, that is, if we have boxes and arrows like that working on the causes, we then try to have a smaller number of general propositions from which we can derive these middle-level propositions. And one of the most general is hierarchy. As hierarchy is stronger in a political system, people mobilize against the hierarchy. So Martin Luther King mobilized against slavery and against racial discrimination. If you're under Saddam Hussein, you fight against Saddam Hussein, and so that's the issue. Toppling the government. After the government topples and you have a more open political, maybe a little more open political system, new issues tend to emerge. So, or put differently, as hierarchy declines, as has been happening for 20 years or more, say in China, the government is growing more open, more generally democratic. I mean, they have some village elections. They don't elect the president of China, but China is becoming, using the internet in many ways, the hierarchy has been generally declining over a medium term. The issues change. Issue politics becomes more important. So there was a group that organized in China that were studying, there's a group called the New Political Culture in China. And so they said, we see this happening in Beijing, that we have people who are walking their dogs. And that's an issue in Beijing. Walking their dogs. Okay. This is not part of Marx's Communist Manifesto or CCCP. Okay. Issue politics and consumption politics tend to emerge with this new political culture, even in China. Okay. I say even because the general level, say 20, 30 years ago, was not as highly developed economically as places like England or Scandinavia or the US, although China obviously is a huge economic growth machine. So the hierarchy idea, as it declines, new issues tend to emerge, and there are many propositions that deal with that in specific institutional arenas, such as the family. As women work more often, the family performs fewer functions economically and socially. Children are less totally encompassed within the family. The patriarchal authority weakens as the father does not have the children work on the family farm as one unit. Instead, they go out and get jobs, or they may get scholarships. So they're less and less dependent on the traditional patriarch. In that sense, families now, if they may eat together less often, or even in China, but certainly in the West, you see a family eating together in many restaurants, and what are they doing half the time? They're not eating, they're playing with their cell phones. Because each person has their own cell phone. That's an amazing indicator of individualization penetrating the traditional family structure. Very crude, but you all know it. You've seen it every day. Okay, so I mean that illustrates one example of the specific propositions we have in the NPC book. Okay. let me pause, well, no, let me push on that, then we'll have a discussion. Let me just say a few words about innovation. Innovation is a big issue which has emerged more explicitly only in the last 20 or 30 years. That is, it's been there obviously for centuries. But it's been codified as the major driver of the economy by people like Daniel Bell, linked with Joseph Schumpeter's economic analysis, Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy. So Schumpeter stressed that the driver of capitalist innovation, not just capitalists, but the driver, but which, including specifically capitalists as well as everywhere, that is, new ideas are critical. New ideas can drive the economy more as we move beyond a simple agricultural economy or a simple material production of cars and so forth. As we move to more abstract symbols, to the arts, to books, to style. That is, I use the example, Apple and Samsung are successful. Are they successful because they've got cheap, excellent machines? Yes, but they've got more. They've added design. And design in turn is linked with being cool, lifestyle, of having a playlist of things you can download and get the music from the Apple Store that works fast and well. And so Samsung and Apple don't advertise, this is cheap and efficient, buy our product. They have pictures of music. They hire artists and entrepreneurs of music that give it a style and a color which transforms it from what it was in the past. That is, there's innovation combined with culture and the arts, which are the next sections of the course in terms of competing drivers with these more traditional concerns. So Daniel Bell was one of the theorists who earlier on articulated, so Schumpeter, Daniel Bell. Bell's book, The Coming of Post-Industrial Society, looked at the emergence of consumption and post-industrial technology, a lot about technology. So for instance, as you have computers, as you have more efficient use of machinery, you need fewer people to do hard work with their backs. And so the big machines, the bulldozers, these things, the tractors, the high-tech tractors in agriculture, they now, they have sensors where they look at the soil, they see, does it need more of this or that kind of fertilizer, and they automatically squirt in the right mixture of fertilizer based on the acidity and the level of how the soil was there in the past and how it changed in the last year. I mean, so tractors do that. I mean, compare that to, the hundreds and hundreds of people who did this by hand a century or so back. Okay, so the same thing in the many examples. Similarly, whole countries that depended on export of coffee or export of aluminum bauxite, such as Guinea in Africa, have had economic disaster come upon them because their export product is